stories aren't about strangers in dark alleys or random acts of violence. Sometimes they're about people we invite into our homes, into our beds, into the most vulnerable moments of our lives. This is a story about trust broken in the most unimaginable way, about a single moment that shattered a life so completely that death became not just an option, but the only bearable escape. This is the story of Mark Van Dongen, and it raises questions we'd rather not ask about love, suffering, and the right to die with dignity. Hey there, this is the ASMR Casebook. If you enjoy my videos, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me grow and create even more relaxing content for you. Your support means the world to me. Thank you for being here. Mark Van Dongen was a Dutch engineer who came to England with dreams and ambitions, like so many young professionals before him. He studied at Bristol University and built a career in construction engineering, the kind of stable, respectable life that would make any parent proud. Bristol became his home, a vibrant city in southwest England where historic architecture meets modern university culture, where the River Avon winds through green spaces and bridges connect communities. Mark was in his 30s when this story takes place, described by colleagues and friends as supportive, kind, the sort of person who would continue to offer help even when it cost him something personally. In 2010, Mark met Berlina Wallace. She was a part-time fashion student at the University of the West of England, nearly 20 years older than Mark, originally from South Africa. Their relationship developed quickly, and soon they were living together in Wallace's flat in Westbury Park, one of Bristol's leafy residential neighborhoods. For 5 years, they were a couple. Mark provided both emotional and financial support throughout their relationship. To the outside world, they might have seemed like any other couple navigating the complexities of modern life together. But relationships, as we all know, can hide darker undercurrents beneath seemingly calm surfaces. By the summer of 2015, something had fundamentally changed. Mark had come to a decision that millions of people reach every year, that painful but necessary realization that a relationship has run its course. He wanted to end things with Berlina. He'd met someone new, someone who made him feel differently, someone who represented a fresh start. Breaking up is never easy, even in the best circumstances, but Mark tried to do it as decently as possible. He told Berlina he would continue to provide financial support. He wasn't abandoning her completely. He was trying to be kind even as he was leaving, but Berlina Wallace was not ready to let go. In fact, she couldn't accept Mark's decision at all. The text messages she sent him throughout August and September 2015 revealed someone spiraling, someone using every emotional manipulation available to try to keep him. She made silent phone calls to his new girlfriend, 14 of them, the kind of harassment that speaks to obsession and denial. She'd threatened to harm herself if Mark left, putting him in an impossible position where his guilt and concern for her well-being became chains keeping him connected to her. Former colleagues of Mark's would later testify that he'd told them about these threats, how Berlina would injure herself and then blame him, how she'd call the police and he'd be the one in trouble. Mark had even told colleagues and his father something chilling. He was scared of Berlina Wallace, and his fear, as it turned out, was entirely justified. What Mark didn't know was that on September 2nd, 2015, Berlina Wallace went shopping, not for groceries or clothes or any of the ordinary things we buy in our daily lives. She purchased a liter of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid. Let that sink in for a moment. 98% concentrated. This wasn't some household cleaning product. This was industrial-grade acid, the kind that can strip flesh from bone, and it wasn't an impulse purchase made in a moment of rage. Police would later discover 82 separate searches on her computer about sulfuric acid. 82. She researched what it could do, the damage it causes, the injuries that result when it's thrown on people. She looked up cases where acid had been used as a weapon. She even clicked on an article about a criminal trial where a man allegedly forced his girlfriend to drink acid, which likely gave her the defense she would later use in court. She removed the warning label from the bottle, the one that clearly stated the acid causes severe burns and eye damage. She removed it deliberately so that if anyone saw it in her flat, they wouldn't immediately recognize the danger. This wasn't passion. This wasn't a crime of sudden rage. This was cold, calculated planning by someone who knew exactly what she intended to do. On the night of September 22nd, 2015, Mark came to Berlina's flat. Despite everything, despite his fear, despite wanting to move on with his life, he came because he was concerned about her. She'd made threats before. She'd talked about harming herself. He arrived at 10 in the evening, probably thinking he could talk to her one more time, maybe help her understand, maybe make sure she was okay. It was the kind of decent impulse that speaks well of someone's character, the same impulse that was about to cost him everything. They were in her flat, in the bed they'd once shared. Mark was wearing only boxer shorts, and at some point in those early morning hours, he fell asleep, vulnerable, nearly naked, trusting that despite everything, despite their problems, he was safe here with someone he'd spent 5 years of his life with. At approximately 3 in the morning, Berlina Wallace made her move. She'd filled a glass with the acid she'd purchased 3 weeks earlier. Mark woke up, probably groggy, confused about what was happening, and then he heard her say 5 words that would haunt everyone who later heard this case. "If I can't have you, no one can." She threw the acid directly at his face and body. What happened next is almost impossible to comprehend. The acid began burning immediately, not the kind of burn you get from touching a hot stove, not something that hurts intensely but heals. This was acid eating through skin, through tissue, through everything it touched. Mark's screams filled the flat, the kind of sounds that no one should ever have to make or hear. The pain was, according to medical experts who would later treat him, excruciating. The worst kind of pain human beings can experience. The acid causes intensive burning pain within seconds of touching skin, and it doesn't stop. It keeps burning, keeps destroying, keeps causing unimaginable agony. And Berlina Wallace did nothing. She didn't call an ambulance. She didn't try to help him. She didn't throw water on him or do any of the things a decent human being would do when someone is screaming in agony right in front of them. Instead, she calmly walked to her living room sofa and called a friend. While Mark's screams echoed through the flat, while his flesh was being eaten away by acid, she sat on her sofa making phone calls. Mark, in his agony and panic, ran, still wearing only his boxer shorts, his face and body burning. He ran out into the street. It was 3 in the morning in a residential neighborhood, but his screams woke people up. Neighbors rushed out to help, seeing this man half-blind, covered in burns, in the worst pain imaginable. They called emergency services immediately. They tried to help him in any way they could, and through it all, Berlina Wallace remained in her flat, ignoring his screams, doing nothing. When the ambulance arrived and rushed Mark to Southmead Hospital, the medical staff were confronted with something they'd rarely seen before. Jonathan Pleat, a consultant in burns surgery, would later state that there had been no equivalent patient with similar extensive injuries following a chemical attack. The burns covered 2/3 of Mark's face and large areas of his upper chest, arms, and upper thighs. Almost all of them were full-thickness burns, meaning they went through every layer of skin and into the tissue beneath. 25% of his total body surface was burned, and because of the skin graft procedures that followed, ultimately 40% of his body would be affected. Mark spent 11 months in the intensive care unit. Think about that. Nearly a year of his life in ICU. He underwent numerous surgical procedures. The acid had not only burned his skin, but damaged his body's systems in ways that cascaded into more and more complications. His left leg had to be amputated because the blood supply was so restricted. He lost the sight in his left eye completely, and his right eye was damaged. He suffered recurrent chest infections. He went into septicemic shock, where infection overwhelms the body. His kidneys were injured. His gut had problems. He had internal bleeding from his bowel. His heartbeat became irregular. His liver function was altered. The doctors gave him the strongest pain relief available, opiates, but even those powerful drugs couldn't fully address the pain he was experiencing, and they came with their own difficult side effects. For 4 months, Mark couldn't really communicate. Imagine being trapped in that level of pain and not being able to even tell people what you're feeling, where it hurts, what you need. Physical therapists worked with him daily, but despite everyone's best efforts, Mark developed something called critical illness neuropathy. His muscles gradually stopped working. By the time he was finally discharged from the hospital in November 2016, more than a year after the attack, Mark Van Dongen was paralyzed from the neck down. He had no movement in his arms or legs. The life he'd known, the independence he'd had, his ability to do even the simplest things for himself, all of it was gone. The doctors told him what the future held. There would be more operations, many more. He would require extensive care for the rest of his life. He would never be able to feed himself, dress himself, use the bathroom by himself. His physical appearance, they told him, would never be restored to anything that could be described as normal. It would be drastically different, unrecognizable to friends and family. He had been permanently and irrevocably disfigured. The facial scarring was categorized at the severe end of very severe scarring, and beyond the physical damage, there was the emotional and psychological trauma that would affect every moment of his remaining life. Mark was moved to a care home. His father, Kees Van Dongen, traveled from the Netherlands to be with him, watching his son suffer in ways no parent should ever witness. Mark suffered from depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. He repeatedly expressed the desire to end his life, not in moments of temporary despair that might pass, but as a consistent, reasoned conclusion about his circumstances. He was trapped in a body that no longer worked, in constant pain despite medication, his face so disfigured that he couldn't recognize himself dependent on others for every single aspect of living, and so Mark Van Dongen made a decision. He would seek voluntary euthanasia in Belgium. Belgium is one of the few countries in the world where euthanasia is legal under specific circumstances. It's not granted lightly. There's a rigorous process, evaluations by multiple doctors, assessments of whether someone is making a clear-minded choice and whether their suffering is truly unbearable, with no prospect of improvement. Mark went through this process. The doctors examined him thoroughly. They considered his physical condition, his psychological state, the prognosis for his future, and they concluded that his was indeed a case of unbearable physical and psychological suffering despite maximum medicinal support. They authorized the procedure. On January 2nd, 2017, 15 months after Berlina Wallace threw acid in his face, Mark Van Dongen died by voluntary euthanasia in Belgium. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He'd lost a leg, an ear, an eye. He lived every day in pain and despair, and he'd concluded, in consultation with medical professionals, that death was preferable to the life he was facing. Meanwhile, Berlina Wallace had been arrested shortly after the attack. When police interviewed her, she didn't confess. She didn't express remorse. Instead, she lied. She claimed that Mark had poured the acid into a glass on her bedside table, intending for her to drink it. She said he was trying to harm her, not the other way around. It was a defense she'd apparently thought about even before carrying out the attack, inspired by that article she'd clicked on during her research, and she stuck to this story throughout the entire investigation and trial. She went further, attempting to destroy Mark's character even after his death. She alleged that he was the abuser in their relationship, that he'd subjected her to verbal and physical abuse. Mark wasn't alive to defend himself against these accusations, but his colleagues testified about what Mark had actually told them, that Berlina would threaten to injure herself and blame him, that he was scared of her. The evidence showed that in 2011 she'd thrown hot water over him, causing injuries that required medical treatment, though Mark had covered for her by telling the doctor he'd accidentally spilled tea on himself. In the summer of 2015, Mark had shown colleagues and his new girlfriend scratches on his body that had been inflicted by Berlina. The picture that emerged during the trial was of a woman with serious anger management issues who'd sought help but never gained control. In 2013, she'd told a university counselor that she'd been physically violent to and had threatened or intimidated other people. She said she got very angry and had hit out and thrown things at her boyfriend. In 2014, she spoke to a psychiatric nurse about trying to control her emotions, particularly anger. She described an adrenaline rush when someone said the wrong thing and said she felt like she could destroy everything around her. In August 2015, just weeks before the attack, she told the same nurse that she wasn't coping well with the breakup, felt angry and betrayed, and worried that her anger might cause problems with Mark and his new girlfriend. All the warning signs were there: the violent history, the threats, the inability to control rage, the obsessive research into acid attacks. But Mark, decent and concerned, and perhaps too trusting, had come to her flat that night anyway. The trial was complicated by one central question: was this murder? Berlina Wallace was charged with murder, but the jury had to grapple with something unprecedented in British Mark hadn't died from the attack itself. He'd survived for 15 months. Then he'd chosen to end his life through legal euthanasia in another country. Could his death be considered murder if he technically made the choice to die? The jury found Berlina Wallace not guilty of murder, but guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent. It was a verdict that sparked considerable debate. Some felt that if Mark hadn't been attacked, he wouldn't have sought euthanasia, so Wallace's actions had directly caused his death. Others argued that euthanasia, being a choice Mark made, broke the chain of causation that would make Wallace legally responsible for his death. At the sentencing hearing in May 2018, Judge Nicola Davies didn't mince words. She told Wallace, "Your intention was to burn, disfigure, and disable Mark Van Dongen so that he would not be attractive to any other woman. It was an act of pure evil." She noted that Wallace had ignored Mark's screams, that she'd chosen not to help him even as he was in agony, that nothing better demonstrated her malicious and callous intention than her refusal to provide any help. The judge sentenced Berlina Wallace to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years before she could be considered for parole. She was deemed dangerous, someone who posed a significant risk to others. The judge pointed to the premeditation, the sadistic nature of the attack, the previous violence toward Mark, and Wallace's demonstrated inability to control her anger. Even after serving the minimum term, Wallace would only be released if the parole board was satisfied she no longer posed a danger to the public. She would remain on license for the rest of her life. But no sentence could bring Mark back. No punishment could undo what happened to him. His father, Keys, had to watch his son suffer for 15 months before finally being released from that suffering through euthanasia. The family Mark was building with his new girlfriend never happened. The career he'd worked for ended. The life he'd lived, with all its ordinary pleasures and freedoms we take for granted, was destroyed in a moment of rage by someone who'd decided that if she couldn't have him, no one could. This case raises profound questions that extend far beyond the individuals involved. It forced Britain to confront the rising problem of acid attacks, which had been increasing in frequency, particularly in London, but also in other cities. The easy availability of concentrated acid, sold for industrial and cleaning purposes, meant that anyone could purchase it without much scrutiny. Following cases like Mark's, there were calls for stricter regulations on acid sales, including age restrictions and requirements for licenses. In January 2018, the UK government announced that sales of acids to anyone under 18 would be banned. The case also highlighted the often overlooked reality of male victims of domestic violence. Mark had been in a relationship where his partner was violent toward him, where he'd been scared, where he'd covered up injuries she'd caused. Statistics show that men can be and are victims of partner abuse, but they often don't report it due to stigma, fear of not being believed, or uncertainty about where to turn for help. Mark's story became a tragic example of how domestic violence can affect anyone, regardless of gender, and how the consequences can be fatal. And then there's the euthanasia question. Mark's decision to end his life through legal euthanasia in Belgium highlighted the different approaches countries take to end-of-life decisions. In the UK, assisted dying remains illegal. Mark had to travel to Belgium to exercise what he felt was his right to die with dignity rather than continue suffering. The debate continues about circumstances should have the option to end their lives on their own terms, with medical support, when they're facing unbearable suffering with no prospect of improvement. Some argue that life is precious under all circumstances, and that euthanasia devalues human life or could be abused. Others contend that true compassion means allowing people to make their own choices about whether suffering has become unbearable. Mark Van Dongen's final months were spent not living but existing, trapped in circumstances most of us can't truly imagine. The doctors who evaluated him for euthanasia concluded that his suffering was unbearable despite maximum medical support. They deemed his request reasonable and his decision sound. And so, on a January day in 2017, surrounded by medical professionals in Belgium, Mark was finally released from the hell that Berlina Wallace had created for him. When we hear stories like this, it's natural to struggle with the enormity of what one person can do to another. The planning, the cruelty, the absolute disregard for another person's humanity. It challenges our understanding of what people are capable of. Berlina Wallace had 5 years with Mark Van Dongen. 5 years of him supporting her emotionally and financially. 5 years of building a life together. And when he decided that life was no longer working for him, when he tried to move on, as people have every right to do, she responded not with sadness or even with temporary rage, but with calculated, researched, premeditated destruction. The phrase, "If I can't have you, no one can," reveals a possessiveness that strips away another person's autonomy, that reduces them to an object to be owned rather than a human being with their own right to make choices about their life. And in acting on that possessiveness, Wallace didn't just try to keep Mark. She destroyed him so thoroughly that after 15 months of unimaginable suffering, death became his most merciful option. Mark Van Dongen came to England to build a life. He studied, worked, loved, made friends, contributed to his community. He was, by all accounts, a good person who tried to do right by others. His story should have been about career success, about finding love, about ordinary happiness. Instead, it became a story about the darkest aspects of human nature, about suffering that pushed the boundaries of what any person should have to endure, and about a choice to die that was ultimately an act of self-determination in the face of circumstances he never asked for and didn't deserve. This is the story of Mark Van Dongen, not the man who died by euthanasia, but the man who lived a life that was stolen from him, who fought to survive for over a year despite unimaginable pain, and who ultimately made the most difficult decision a person can make. May he rest in the peace that eluded him in those final 15 months of his life. Thank you for listening to the case of Mark Van Dongen. We'll be back next Thursday with a new case. Stay safe and pay attention to the details. They matter.